Big warm welcome to the Results UK's National Conference. For those of you joining just now and don't know me, my name's Oxley. I'm the Executive Director of Results UK. If you're just joining us and you're wondering what you've wandered into, Results UK is an advocacy organisation with a vision to end global poverty, and we're just thrilled to have you with us today as part of our national conference. For those of you that have been with us all weekend, which actually looks like most of you, welcome back. So in this session, we're going to hear from two keynote speakers who are both true leaders in our sector, Professor Jeff Sax and Dr. Sriskandaraja. We're going to have a chance for some questions and discussions after our second speaker. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. This session, like the rest of the conference, will be recorded, so please do be aware of that and feel free to turn off your video if you prefer. Throughout the session, you can put questions into the question function and we'll do our best to get to those. Closed captions should be turned on, so click on live transcript at the bottom of the screen to access those, and the computer will do its best to provide a running transcript. And so without further ado, I'm actually going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jeff Sax. Jeffrey Sax is a university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He's also president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. He's been an advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General and currently serves as an SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees. Jeff was twice named as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and was ranked by the Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. And if you haven't seen his recent speech at the preparatory meeting for the upcoming Food System Summit, I have no hesitation in recommending it as the most unmissable and powerful 10 minutes of the entire thing. Now, he's authored numerous bestseller books. His most recent book is from just last year, The Age of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. But most importantly to me, Professor Sachs wrote a book way back in 2005 that spoke strongly to me and that I've been recommending to people ever since. It's called The End of Poverty, How We Can Make It Happen in Our Lifetime. Now, if you've been around Results for a while, you know that ending poverty in our lifetime is quite literally the reason we exist. Professor Sachs' meticulously researched and passionately argued approach to bringing about the end of poverty is just one that spoke to me just as powerfully today as it did the first time when I read it. Professor Sachs' works is one of the strongest antidotes to cynicism that I've ever found. And when times are tough, as they are now, we need this more than ever. Now, Jeff is a long-standing friend and partner of Results in the US, but this is the first time he's made the trip across the pond to Britain to join us at Results UK, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome him here to speak. Now, we're going to be having, Jeff, it really is. We're going to be having a bit of a dialogue today, and really looking at how, when we're talking about the end of poverty and injustice, we can really only achieve that through deepening our understanding of how everything that we work on is interconnected and how we can balance all of those competing and urgent priorities, because there's certainly just so much work to be done. So I guess my first question to you, targets and all the rest of it, and they all seem important. But at the end of the day, what we're actually ultimately all about is making sure that actual people can permanently exit global poverty and live lives of dignity and justice. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about how you see some of the best ways to go about doing that and balancing all of those competing priorities to really put people at the heart of what we're looking for?
Great, Aaron, thanks so much. And to all of the leaders of Results UK, thank you for having me. Thank you for your great work. Indeed, I've been a fan and admirer of Results for many, many years and have worked closely with Results US and Joanne Carter on many initiatives, including her leadership in the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and many other public health ventures. I'll say one thing to start, Aaron, which is we've actually seen, of course, in East Asia mainly, the remarkable, unprecedentedly rapid decline of poverty over the last 40 years. And we should take note of this. There's a lot of China bashing around, but I'm not part of that. I disagree with it. I think that China's success in ending extreme poverty, starting from around 80% of China's population by World Bank estimates being in extreme poverty in 1980, down to essentially zero now, first tells us, look at what can be accomplished. That's within 2 generations, a country of 1.4 billion people ended mass extreme poverty. Africa is the same size population as China, 1.4 billion people. Africa's poverty has come down as a proportion significantly over the last 30 years through the Millennium Development Goals, now through the Sustainable Development Goal phase, but it still is relatively high. It's the main site of extreme poverty on the planet. Maybe 25% of the population. Numbers are vague, hard to be precise. And in the COVID period, God knows, we just don't know really what's happening on the ground. But Africa has been on a path of gradual decline of proportion of the population in extreme poverty. China accomplished this incredible feat. And by the way, other countries in East Asia have made remarkable progress as well. All of it is to say, let's be practical, pragmatic, and understand what's the core of that success. The core of the success is investment, and investment in 3 areas: in human beings, in their health, nutrition, and education. So especially investment in children. Economists use the dry term human capital, kind of ugly, but the fact of the matter is helping children to grow in a healthy way and to achieve their cognitive and education and skill potential is the most important single investment. Second is infrastructure. You cannot develop without basic infrastructure. That means electricity, it means connectivity, it means basic transport, especially public transport facilities. Third is an environment then in which businesses in different sectors, whether it's agriculture or mining or manufacturing or services, tourism, internationally traded services, can develop. Those services and industries can't develop unless there are healthy, skilled young people and unless there is a basic infrastructure. So we have to invest in advance of the business. We don't wait for the business development to come. That's waiting a long time. Business will say, well, we would be there, but there's not enough electricity, not enough skilled workers, transport conditions are high, and so forth. To put it simply, this whole thing is not magic. This whole thing is a basic investment strategy, because we know what a more prosperous society looks like. We don't have a huge mystery of what it takes to go from conditions of poverty to conditions of relative prosperity, but it requires a generation of building skills, knowledge, educated young people, and then having them with the tools, with the connectivity and so forth to be able to find highly productive activities, whether it's their own businesses, whether it is being in the workforce of an international company online, and so on. Now, what's stopping all of this is first, obviously, disease, and COVID right now is stopping all coherent action. And the main thing we need for that is, and it's unbelievable that it's not happening properly, is a globally organized, coherent timeline for vaccine coverage everywhere. This is doesn't take any deep insight to know that's the case. What is shocking is how the UK, the US, the EU, China, and Russia and India have not gotten together around the table to say, okay, here's what we're going to do in the next 6 months to make sure this happens. That is number one. And for God's sake, how can we be leaving this to Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, as if this is a market-based activity rather than a matter of global, urgent priority and planning? So that's the first thing. We've got to stop this pandemic. Otherwise, we can't even think straight. Then, second, we need to make sure that there is the financing available to carry out these basic investments. The point I made in the End of Poverty 16 years ago, and the point that we have proved repeatedly in the Global Fund and Gavi and elsewhere, if the financing is there, the solutions are there. This is the basic point. And rich people don't like to share. That's also the basic point. And the thing that is so weird about our world today is that we have 2,700 billionaires in the world, and they have $15 trillion of wealth right now. And then we say, oh, where's the money going to come from? Instead of taxing the wealth or demanding that these mega billionaires, instead of their 15-minute space flights, actually contribute to these solutions. Why aren't they putting big bucks in results? And if they want to take a 15-minute space flight, let them also put some money into results to get this done. So we basically have a financing challenge, and for that we need taxes. Unfortunately, in the United States, one political party is so unbelievably corrupt, the Republican Party, that the idea of taxing anyone is an anathema. And the other party, I'm waiting to see whether they can actually overcome the campaign contributions and all the rest to actually do something. And we're going to have some important votes in the US on that in the next few weeks. It's going to be a close call whether all that big talk about social fairness and social justice fades away when congressmen have to vote to raise taxes on their wealthy contributors. That's what we're facing right now. So long-winded answer, but the answer is yes, poverty can really be ended. We've seen it in a very large part of the world. It's happening in other parts of the world, at least it was up until COVID. And it's a matter of practical steps, investments based on available financing. And one thing, just to conclude this observation, the G20 could agree on a significant historic increase of financing for developing countries. And since the G20 it'll take place at the end of October in Rome, this is one important point for results to campaign on. That's just coming up in 6 weeks. And second, the G20 presidency will then go to Indonesia. And the government of Indonesia, major developing country, large and influential one, is extremely keen on expanding financing for sustainable development. And I think we have a great opportunity in the coming year in the G20 process to get trillions of dollars oriented towards the end of poverty.
Jeff, thank you so much for that. I think that one of the things that really stood out to me in the speech you gave at the Food System Summit was that as an economist, you work with trillions rather than billions. And I think this is something really powerful. I mean, we in Results, we think we're playing with the big boys when we talk about the £10 billion a year UK aid budget. So it's refreshing to be challenged to set our sights even higher. I mean, I think you've talked about some of them. What are the other key things that high-income governments need to be doing in terms of addressing poverty and global injustice?
Well, I think, first of all, let's just get a couple of numbers clear. The world output is $100 trillion a year, which is a convenient number because it's easy to find percentages. It means that a $1 trillion flow of any kind, whether it's for investments or spending and whatever, is 1% of world output. And so when we're talking about $10 billion US, we're talking about 1% of 1% of world output. Second number that I mentioned is $15 trillion. That's the wealth of the billionaires in the world, which is pretty interesting because there are 2,700 billionaires, according to Forbes magazine. If each of them had just 1 billion, which isn't bad, by the way, you can survive on that. If each had just 1 billion, they'd have a combined worth of 2.7 trillion. But instead, they have a combined worth of 15 trillion. So there's a little bit even more than each of them having a billion. There's an excess 13 trillion. I'll call it an excess, because what the heck can you do with that? And why aren't we deploying that towards ending poverty, fighting climate change, stopping this pandemic, and so on? And that is really because they don't pay taxes. They're not asked to pay taxes. People are bedazzled with that wealth, or some people are. And that's really an issue too. So our economy is 100 trillion a year, but boy, it's pumping more and more of that to the very top, especially in the digital age with the giant digital platforms, with the 100 to 200 billionaires that the tech revolution has created. And we need to mobilize that funding. If they want to give it as philanthropy, I'm all for that. If they want to pay it as taxes, that's fine too. But one way or another, that needs to be mobilized.
Jeff, thanks so much for that. Now, I know we've got to the half hour, and that's when you said you had to go, but I'm wondering, do you have time for just one more question?
I do, yeah.
That's great. So, I think, one of the things that I really love about results work is that where we start from is that there is enough wealth in the world to solve the problems. That's kind of underpins the way we think about everything it is that we do. And, sometimes it feels that money's tight. We've just had a £5 billion a year cut to the UK aid budget. It's been a really tough year, a couple of years for development in the UK. What are the reasons to be hopeful? What are the bright sparks on the horizon? What gets you excited to get out of bed in the morning and do this work? Where are we going? Because I think I can see a few things, but I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think there are many reasons to be hopeful. There are many reasons to be worried as well. But the reasons to be hopeful are, first, that the tools have become so good and so powerful. I was just looking at a new report of the Broadband Commission, which will be coming out shortly. And it shows that while more than 3 billion people right now are not on internet, and that's really a serious problem in a digital age, at the same time, almost all of those people already are in a place where they could have access to internet, but they don't because they're too poor, and so on. But the coverage is already there. So we could have a massive expansion, for example, of digital access. It's a matter of a financing model. And think of what digital access means. It means access to telemedicine. It means access to online education services. It means access to e-payments. It means access to e-government. Many important things can be done. And the problem is not a technical problem. The problem is a financial problem. So that's a good thing. Think of all the things that now can be done with telemedicine. Unbelievable compared to what the situation in remote, poor, rural areas was 10 or 15 years ago. We can get x-rays read, obviously, anywhere instantaneously. We can do diagnostics. We can get emergency services. and so forth. But we need some organization. So the tools are extremely powerful. I am every day a supporter of the idea that we ought to be getting together with China, with Russia, with all countries to have a global strategy on this, rather than having some new Cold War, new conflict, and so on. The fact, as incredibly incompetent and awful as it was, the way it was done, that the US is finally waking up to the futility of this long period of war is a positive thing. The fact that the US is so completely divided right now is obviously not a good thing. But as bad as COVID has been, it's also forced people to realize how unequal the world situation is, how the fact that not only did the wealthy not suffer, they got incredibly rich during COVID. Stock markets have boomed. It's a little shocking, actually, how this has gone down. And so in this regard also, there is a sense in the G20, we really need to do something different. By the way, the G20 itself is a matter for hope, because we have an institution where rich and developing countries sit down together and actually discuss and even adopt real policies, like the recent SDR allocation, which is a good thing. I've recommended in that speech that you mentioned at the pre-food summit that Africa, in the form of the African Union, be admitted as be welcomed as the 21st member of that body, because the European Union sits as EU, so we should have the AU in the G20 as well. That would bring in 1.4 billion people more. That would bring in the continent that is actually most in need of this kind of partnership. It would add several percent of GDP globally to the table. So it would make the G20 or the G21 a far more representative process without undoing its ability to actually do business, because it is a more limited number of major countries around the table. But if we get the African Union at the table, that will also make a very, very big difference. We shouldn't lose heart. It is disappointing. The Anglo-Saxon world's really not in a good way in governance right now. I won't go into the situation in the UK, but I can tell you the situation in the US, though we have a very nice man as president and a very good person, very experienced, we are so much at civil war in this country, in culture wars and all the rest, that it's very hard to see US leadership at all. But having said that, let's not depend on one country. Let us really emphasize that the world together needs to do this. Focus on practical opportunities. I think the G20 is key. The Secretary General's statement released this past week called Our Common Agenda is very important for everybody to know and to read. Very clear, very well put, very much directed towards practical solutions. So all I'll say in the end, results is on exactly the right track. It is aiming at the achievable highest priority target in absolutely pragmatic ways. Results voice matters a lot, and let's focus on key opportunities. The G20 in Rome, COP26 in Glasgow just a few days after that, and then what will be potentially a historic period of negotiation, this coming year of the G20 that will then culminate in the G20 Bali in Indonesia next year, we could have a real breakthrough in international financing to achieve SDG 1, the end of poverty.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Thank you so much for joining us today on your Sunday morning, giving up time to join us. I know we've gone way over time, so
pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Cheers. All right. So unfortunately, Jeff did have to run, but it's if you're anything like me, that was pretty special. It was wonderful to have him come and join us. Let's move straight on to our second keynote speaker today. Oh, and apologies to everybody who put questions in the chat. We unfortunately just didn't have time to get to those. Jeff, as you saw, was pretty verbose, lots to say. We're going to jump through onto our second keynote speaker. That's Danny Sriskandarajah. He's also not actually able to join us in person, but he's provided all of his remarks via a 10-minute video message. So we're going to play that in just a second. Danny, unfortunately, won't be able to hear me praising him and his work in my introduction for him. But of course, it's a real pleasure to have such a powerful and thoughtful UK and global leader joining us today as well. Now, Danny became the chief executive of Oxfam GB in January of 2019. It's a post he holds right now. Previously, he led Civicus, that's the global alliance of civil society organizations with members in more than 180 countries. And prior to that, he spent 4 years as Director General of the Royal Commonwealth Society. Now, Danny was born in Sri Lanka in the 1970s, and his family was displaced by the onset of a brutal civil war. After that, he lived in Papua New Guinea and Australia before moving to the UK in 1998. He completed his master's and doctorate in international development at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Danny is a great guy. He's just passionate about the power of civil society to challenge injustice and tackle the root causes of poverty. He's a regular blogger and media commentator, and he tweets at DHNNJYN. We'll drop that in the chat in just a second. So do feel free to send thanks and comments about his message to us this morning directly. So let's assume that the tech angels have everything queued up correctly, and we're going to go over and hear from Danny.
Hello everyone, it's a real pleasure to join you, at least virtually, for this year's Results UK National Conference. I think you've picked a really important and timely set of issues to talk about. I think we really do need to recognise that we are living in an increasingly interconnected world, and we, those of us who care about building a more just and sustainable world, need to find those key points, those key opportunities, those key chances to drive tangible, meaningful, lasting change on the issues that matter, but at the same time recognizing how those issues fit within a wider picture. And for me, I think the Sustainable Development Goals give us a really good roadmap for how to do that. In fact, I remember being involved in some of those discussions leading up to the creation of the SDGs and thinking what a powerful way of trying to recognize the joined up broad ambition that Agenda 2030 represents, but within it having clear goals, clear targets, clear milestones, clear indicators, so that we can reconcile this need to drive change on individual aspects of what we're trying to do, while also recognizing the bigger picture. And at Oxfam, I think we have a similar approach. We are an organization that has now for almost 80 years believed in taking action to end poverty, but also speaking out to make sure that those policies that keep people and communities in poverty, those drivers of discrimination and injustice, are also addressed. And I suspect there we have a lot in common between what Oxfam does and our view of the world, and what Results does and your view of the world. And I also think this is a timely conversation because of COVID-19 and the dramatic, real, immediate, and probably long-lasting impacts COVID-19 will have on all of us, but particularly people in the poorest and most marginalized parts of the planet. And I think that said, those of us who are interested in driving positive change I hope, see some of the opportunity here, some of the opportunity to create a truly just recovery from this pandemic, an opportunity to drive system change in a way that we might not have even imagined was possible a few years ago. And let me give you a few examples that Oxfam's working on. Let's take Goal 1 and ending poverty. We are really worried, as I'm sure you are, about rising levels of hunger. We have more people in need of humanitarian assistance today than at any time since the Second World War. And many of those really important bits of progress that the world has made over the last few decades are being reversed by the economic disruptions that the pandemic has resulted in. And yet, I think we've seen a sharper focus on the need to provide the basic necessities, a basic protection, a social floor, if you will, for all of us on the planet. And I hope we can use this moment to remind ourselves that if we truly are a civilized species, then we need to do much more to make sure that every one of us has those basic necessities to be able to survive, to not experience extreme hunger. And of course, that's why we think it's such a tragedy that governments like the UK have decided now, in the midst of this global humanitarian emergency, to cut aid budgets. And I hope we can work together on reminding leaders in countries like the UK that they have an urgent moral obligation to make sure we resource that fight for basic necessities, social protection for all of us on the planet. And I think that's really important, to draw that link between extreme hunger and poverty and wider social protection that feels urgent. If you look at Goal 3, I see similar linkages. I hope the world learned some really important lessons from this pandemic, but I hope those lessons include meaningful action on intellectual property rights. It is deeply frustrating that we are arguing about access to limited doses of the COVID vaccine, arguing about who gets what share of the pie, when the really important answer is around increasing the size of the pie by making sure that there's a compulsory intellectual property waiver around COVID vaccine, so that we can dramatically increase and distribute the production of COVID vaccines so that all of us around the planet have equal, free, easy access to the vaccine. And again, if you think about this sort of opportunity here to use this really important, urgent, worrying issue of access to vaccines to drive longer term, more equitable change. I also see it around some of the work we're doing on Goal 5 and gender equality. We are reminded in this pandemic of the important role that those of us in our societies who care for others do, and particularly women who care, who provide the bulk of paid and unpaid care around the world. And of course, here in the UK this week, we've been talking about social care. And I think, I see an opportunity here, if you take that particular issue, to say, how do we rewrite social norms and policy approaches to how care is provided and valued in our societies? Can we use this as a moment to an opportunity to make sure that we change some of those norms in favor of, to address gender equality, to make sure that the paid and unpaid responsibilities that many of us are called on to do are valued in an appropriate way? Oxfam produced a report last year that estimated the total value of unpaid care to the global economy is something like $11 trillion, 3 times the size of the global IT sector. But whereas we celebrate the role of IT in our society and our economies, we rarely talk about the value of care that's being provided. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to take an issue like that, situate it in the wider context, and drive real change. And then finally, I suspect I don't need to remind you of this, Goal 13 and climate action is another obvious area where I think there are some really important opportunities, particularly around, in our case, equity and climate justice. it is deeply, deeply unfair that the people who had the least to do with causing climate change are already facing the biggest burdens around the impact of climate change. You know, the richest 10% of us on the planet have been responsible for causing 50% of emissions. And yet people in the poorest parts of the world who've had nothing or little to do with that are already facing displacement. I mean, Oxfam estimates that 20 million people a year in the last decade, one person every 2 seconds, has been displaced by some form of extreme weather event that's been caused by climate breakdown. And so, you know, let's use this opportunity, especially ahead of COP26, to remind ourselves, remind the public in Britain that we are deeply interconnected when it comes to our climate, and we have deep moral obligations to make sure that we take dramatic action, that we resource climate adaptation, we fund loss and damage to make sure that we build a more sustainable future, but also one that is far more just. Now, I could go on, but I hope I've just reminded you of how important it is to link individual issues with the broader context, the local to the global, the things we care about deeply, but in allyship with the things our partners, our fellow travelers care about. And, you know, I think it's really important that each of us takes a stance about the things we care about. You know, each of us will have a slightly different configuration about the things that motivate us, the things that annoy us, the things that we're angry about. And I think it's really important to lean into that. But it's also important to make sure that we join the dots so that we're being strategic about the issues that we can influence now that will have immediate impacts on relieving poverty or hunger, but will also have longer term lasting impacts that will achieve greater social protection, that will achieve climate justice, that will achieve a more equitable distribution of vaccines and health treatments for all, that will achieve dramatic changes in social norms that empower women. So I think there is urgent immediate action on key individual issues, but in the context of the bigger goal, which really is a more just and sustainable world for us. So thank you very much. I hope your discussions are going well, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Danny. I know you can't hear me, but when you watch it back, really, really great. I think we've only got a few minutes left in the session, so I'll do my best to make the most of the time that we do have. I mean, I think it was really interesting to hear from Professor Sachs in terms of where we're looking at a $100 trillion global economy, and then wonderful that Danny brought in the fact that Professor Sachs' calculations potentially missed out $11 trillion worth of unpaid care. And I think this is really, really powerful. I mean, to think that, you know, there is so much work going on in the world that is not even being counted. Look, we've heard a lot of stuff from our two speakers, from the very big down to the very personal. And I really love how Danny finished by linking it back to the things that we're all individually passionate about, the things that we care about, the things that make us stand up and go, no, that's not okay, and I want to do something about that. And so I've kind of got a question for the last few minutes that's a little bit for all of you, and one that you should feel free to flip back and ask of me too, which is, given what you've just heard, what does all of this mean for you? If you're not yet involved in doing advocacy work, are you inspired to start? If you are, does hearing our speakers today make you want to do things differently or better? And I think also, what do you think this means for the work of results? I mean, we work on a lot of the priorities that Professor Sachs talked about. You know, I tend to think we try and do quite well of connecting all those issues to each other. But we'd love to hear a little bit from you. We've got a few minutes to explore all of this. And, you know, and like to invite some more comments in the chat. There's a few there I'm going to try and tackle in a second, but just wanted to ask those questions to you all, and just to see if people have questions for me, and I'll do my very best to step into Professor Sachs and Dr. Danny Sriskandarajah's shoes. If I don't hear any, I'm just going to try and tackle a couple from the chat. So let me do that. So I think we've got a few comments in the chat about the kind of the momentum of wealth, effectively, in terms of the way that the rich world has a lot of assets and tends to set things up so that they hang on to them. I think this is something where we need to take a lot of heart. I mean, if we look at the percentages involved, the numbers are quite low. We campaign in the UK for many years on getting to 0.7% of our gross national income being spent as overseas development assistance. And sure, we recently lost quite a lot of that. We went down from 0.7% to 0.5%. It was a loss of £5 billion per year in terms of aid. But I think what the heart I take from the conversation from both Jeff and from Danny is that given the scale and scope of the global economy, there's plenty of wealth in there that can be directed towards the things that we care about, and the work that we're doing in results is really key to unlocking that. I think also to come to Princess's question, which I don't want to dodge. It's a very, I'm definitely not going to claim to be speaking on behalf of Danny or behalf of Oxfam. But what I will say is that it's very clear to me that, you know, in our sector, we need to hold ourselves to a very high standard, to the highest standards, and that any exploitation of any kind is just simply not okay. It's inexcusable and it's unacceptable. And I think I'm personally very proud at the response that the sector has made over the last few years in response to that, in terms of upgrading all of our processes around safeguarding, in terms of shining a light into places where light was not being shone before. And that's not to say that we're anywhere near solving that problem. I mean, this is something where we need to be vigilant and keep constant pressure. But I certainly would be very comfortable to go on record and say that our response as an overall sector has been robust and vigorous. And I think that that's we're making really good moves in that direction. And we should be holding ourselves to that higher standard. Do we have any other questions coming through that people want to ask? If not, I'm going to use the last few minutes to just reiterate something that Jeff Sax shared when in his closing remarks. He said that on writing in the right way. I think it's wonderful to hear somebody who is standing so close to many of the important levers of power in the world say that to us about our work. I certainly take courage from that, and I hope that you do too. He definitely knows how to make change happen, and to hear from him that we are really having an impact is really, really encouraging. And I hope that's something that you can take very much from this session.